I've come to this valley in southeast Wales here in Monmouthshire, and although it's June, the sky is grey and we've had exceptional rainfall during this month. So much so that it's led to flooding and fatalities even here in the Welsh borderlands. But is this recent flooding truly exceptional? I've been undertaking research in this river valley for the past 10 years, and my results help us to piece together the flooding history of this valley, and maybe it's applicable wider to other valleys here in Wales.
The Olway Brook is a tributary to the River Usk, and the Usk has its headwaters up in the Brecon Beacons, and from there it flows all the way down to the Severn Estuary. Now, over the last few months we've had particularly wet weather in South Wales, and in fact all over the United Kingdom. Although just before that, in the spring, we did have a very dry, warm spell, which did bake the ground. But once the rain started, earlier on in May and into June, the runoff of that rainfall from the hills ran down into the fields through these little streams, and it ponded up on the floodplains. Now, the floodwaters we see here aren't floods from the river. They're floods of surface runoff coming down the hills. But in a sense, it looks just like any other sort of flood. It's a bit like actually walking through the Everglades in Florida. The Everglades are simply grasslands that are flooded, again, simply just by rainwater, and that's what we're seeing here. So over a number of days, rain falling on the hills and the catchment of these river valleys flows down the hillside as surface runoff and then ponds on the floodplains. And in some cases, when it starts to fall, the floodwaters fall, you can pick out some of the old river channels that crisscross these floodplains, like this one here on the Olway Brook Valley. River levels in Wales are monitored by the Environment Agency, and they do this through a network of river monitoring stations, such as this one here on the Olway Brook near Usk. They have a range of techniques in which they measure the river levels. This is a channel with concrete sides, and in the middle there's a weir which the water flows over, and instruments measure the level of the river in that channel at any one time.
By looking at the modern Olway Brook, we can see that it sits within quite a deep river channel. Now, the floodwaters have subsided quite substantially overnight, and so the water today is just in the bottom of the channel. But if we look to the sides, we can see that the channel itself has quite steep banks, and here the banks are vegetated with nettles and grasses and hogweed and so on. Now, these banks, of course, are comprised of sediment, and the top of the bank is the floodplain of the Olway Brook, and it's the flooding surface. Now, these banks and the sediment underneath them grow up as the river floods year to year, bringing with it sediment that it's transporting from the hills in the catchment, and then when it gets onto the floodplain, it deposits the sediment, and that settles out into the grasses and so on, and so the floodplains build up over time. It's these layers of sediment that are the pages of history that I'm investigating. When we look below the water and we look at the sediments underneath the river, we actually go back into a different time period, because below the water level today, below the bed of the river, we find sediments that were laid down during the last ice age. And so the river that we see today and the sediments of the floodplain sit on top of that ice age land surface.
Here the banks of the brook are overgrown, so we can't actually see the floodplain sediments. So I'm off to a different location where we may get a glimpse of the deposits. Now, just downstream of this bridge there's been some local erosion, and that's due to currents flowing under the bridge during flood times that scours off the banks and keeps them quite fresh, so we can actually look at the sediment. Now, you'll see that the sediment here is a reddish brown colour, and that red colour comes from the iron content of the sediment. The local stone around here is called Old Red Sandstone, and it's come directly from that. And it's given it a very characteristic colour that makes it very well known as the Red Land of Gwent.
Now, here by this cliff in the bank, and it's full of this floodplain sediment. Now underneath this we have sediments from the Ice Age, But since then, we've had about 2.5 meters thick of river sediments being flooded out onto the floodplain, and then the build-up of these wonderful sequences of floodplain alluvium, as we call it. Now, it's about 2.5 meters thick, and it spans 6,500 years of time. And so we can look in this sequence for clues about the history of the flooding of this valley, the Olway Brook in Monmouthshire in South Wales. Now, I've been able to date this sediment using a combination of radiocarbon dating, but also using the archaeology that I find stratified within the sequence. Now, by plotting all those dates, I've been able to find out that this sequence of about 2.5 meters of sediment has been deposited over 6,500 years, but that the top meter of it, over a third of it, was deposited only within the last 1,000 years. And there are reasons for why that has happened. First of all, we can look to the increase of agriculture in this area. About 1,000 years ago, the Normans came, and the Normans settled this area. They built a castle in the neighbouring town here, and they started to develop in a big way the agriculture of this area, put different systems in place which enabled the agriculture to grow and develop. But although it did increase then, the most startling aspect of this sequence is that the very top, well, the 50, 60 centimetres or so have been deposited within the last 200 years. And we can relate that perhaps to the mechanisation within agriculture, to increased deforestation in the hills that have opened up the soil to soil erosion. That soil has come down, and we can see from the colour of the river today that that process of soil erosion is still going on, because the water is muddy with the silt and mud from the soils of the catchment. And that increase in soil erosion has increased the rate at which the floodplain sediments have been deposited. One of the consequences of that, of course, is that as the floodplain builds up, you reduce the amount of space that the floodwater can occupy. So when it does flood, as it has done recently, it's like a bathtub overflowing. Where's that water going to go? You've displaced a lot of the space because of more sediment. That increases the potential of flooding the towns and villages that lie within or close to the river valley. To that, we can add, of course, the uncertainties around climate change. And I know that from my studies here that this valley has responded to climate change in the past by flooding and increased waterlogging of the surfaces. Maybe that will happen again with future climate change.
The recent flooding that's occurred here has now drained off the floodplain, so you can see that it's exposed. The cattle are back down here, and you can just see how close those houses are to the floodplain itself, and of course at risk of flooding. Floodwaters often leave behind telltale signs. On these leaves, for example, there's a fine layer of silt that's settled out from the floodwater. Where the surface is unvegetated, you can see the mud is bare, and of course it's this deposition of silt that's so important for floodplains, because it's this that builds up the floodplains, allowing them to grow. In the channel itself, where the currents are strong, that can actually erode the bank, and here it's undermining farmers' fences. But in some places, the floodwaters actually deposit sediment within the channel. Here we can see a mud bank that has been deposited by the river as it's flown through when the water's been high. Now, this is important for the bank because it helps to build up sediment in front of eroded cliffs, and so it helps to maintain the position of banks. Investigating the flood history of the Usk and Olway valleys has been fascinating, but I'm only really just starting to unpick the story. So before long, I'll be back to collect more evidence and to carry on my research.